Peter came back and got his king in him when he stood on Pentecost and preached. Dr. Rice used to say, preached on the corner of State and some other street in Chicago, Randolph Street in Chicago, in the back end of a pickup truck, and had 3,000 people got saved. He got his king back. Christian, is there no king in thee? She died at 96, and I called her mama, but her crown fit squarely on her head to the last moment. Mrs. Rice went to heaven a few weeks ago, but the last time we saw her, she had royalty in her blood, and she had her crown on her brow. I like to look at some people in this room. I think about the Neimeyers up here. There's his family sitting right there beside him. There's his kingdom, and there's the king. I like that. I like to look over here and see John Woosley. Brother, when his kids come home from out of town, they sit there with Mom and Daddy. I like that. And there's his kingdom, and there's the king. You don't have to be a preacher to be a king. You don't have to be a king to be a king. You don't have to be a mayor of a town to be a king. You don't have to be a president of a college to be a king. Listen, you can be a king if you'll just be a man. I look at Brother Bordway leading the choir, and I see royalty. I look at Randy Erickson on his job here, in charge of the maintenance of our building. He walks down the hallways not like somebody who has a menial little task with no importance. He walks down the hallway proud. Why? He has king inside of him. For 30 years I saw Ed Roush, board of our deacons, and never saw him without king in him. We buried Mrs. Loser a few days ago. Miss Loser had royalty in her to the end. Ruth Elaine Bartell always wore a crown everywhere she went. Only had 2 dresses, but she always had that invisible robe on her, that invisible crown of queenliness, and that invisible scepter, always a queen. Our staff men, our administrators, have king in them. Is there no king in thee, Sunday school teacher? Why don't you get on your face before God and say, with the grace of God, I'm looking at my class every Sunday from this moment forward with that one thing in mind. There may be a king or a queen out there somewhere. Is there no king in thee, college teacher? Flippantly go to class maybe. It's your job. It's a duty for you. Every time you walk in a class at Hyles Anderson College, you ought to stop and say, there's the next Billy Sunday out there. Pray tell me, if he doesn't come from Hyles Anderson College, where is he going to come from? Look at that class. Years ago, there was a headmaster in Germany who went to his class every day, and he would bow and take off his hat and bow before his boys. He was a school teacher and sort of a principal school teacher, headmaster. Somebody asked him one time, said, why in the world do you always, every morning, you walk in there and you bow and take your hat off the presence of those little old kids? Why? He said, because I know not what great learned men sit in my classroom. What he was saying is, there's probably a king out there. And there was. Because sitting in his classroom that very morning was a little boy about that high whose name was Martin Luther. I wonder how many cases we'll find at the judgment seat of Martin Luthers who were there who never became Martin Luthers because the Sunday school teacher or the school teacher didn't say there may be a king out there. I wonder how many kings have been aborted. I'm not talking about killing an unborn baby now. I'm talking about killing an unborn king. Karl Marx came to the United States of America. Karl Marx went to New York City and visited regularly a Baptist church. Karl Marx said he found nothing genuine in those people. One Sunday school teacher who realized there was a king out there could have changed Karl Marx and changed the Bolshevik Revolution. Mahatma Gandhi, the man who influenced more people than any person in my lifetime. Mahatma Gandhi made the statement when somebody witnessed to him one time about Jesus. He said, I would become a Christian if it were not Christians. I'll tell you what he was saying. He was saying, give me a preacher who realizes there's some king on the inside of him. Give me a Sunday school teacher who has kings in his class, and give me a school teacher, a Hammond Baptist school teacher, a City Baptist school teacher, a Hammond Baptist high school teacher, a Hammond Baptist grade school teacher, a Hammond Baptist junior high school teacher, a Hyles Anderson College teacher who walks to class and doffs his head and bows and says, there are kings out there. I'm going to give it my best. Bus captains. There are kings out there. We've seen it in this decade. We've seen a king in Colonel North. A man indicted and convicted for a crime, as far as I'm concerned, he did not commit. We've seen that man tried, but you never saw Mr. North interrogated by a bunch of weaklings interrogating strength, or a bunch of crooks interrogating purity. You never saw him one time when he was being questioned about his activities. You never saw him one time, but what he had, a crown on his head, there was king in him. You could tell it. And Admiral Poindexter came. You could tell a difference. Those other men came. You could tell a difference. Why? There was king in Mr. North. We've seen it in other secular areas. We've seen it in Tom Landry. You don't make them like that anymore. Tell you what happened when Tom Landry was fired. A little peon defrocked the king because he had some money. But in spite of the fact that he was fired and lost his job, you can still see king inside of Tom Landry. We've seen it in Pat Nixon, one of the finest ladies, I think, in our generation outside the Christian field. Let me go ahead and say it. We've seen it in Richard Nixon, who didn't do any more than Mr. Johnson did, any more than Mr. Kennedy did. He just happened to get caught by a bunch of pinkos that wanted him out of office, that's all. When you saw him that day on your television screen, if you did, when he said goodbye to his White House staff and he and Pat got on that helicopter, and anybody that had a tear in their soul wept as they saw him wave his hand, there was royalty still there. We've seen it in Lee Robertson. We've seen it in Paul Bear Bryant. Every field we know. What's the difference in Paul Bear Bryant and the other college coaches? There's a king inside of Paul Bear Bryant. This story has been told often from this pulpit. I was on a plane one day flying to North Carolina, to Greensboro High Point Airport. Right across from me was a man whose voice I recognized and whose face I recognized. He was the basketball coach, University of Kentucky, named Adolph Rupp. I looked over and I said, by the way, he won more basketball games, still has, I think, than any other man who's ever coached in the college ranks. I said, Mr. Rupp, I said, my name is Jack Hyles. I said, I'm a fan of yours. And he said to me, he said, sir, I'm glad to meet you. With his southern drawl, said, yes, sir. I said, I pastor a church outside of Chicago. He said, yes, sir, I've heard of that great church. That's that large church outside Chicago. We talked on the airplane. Talked about his future. He was getting up in years. In fact, he was already 70 at the time. After we had chatted for about an hour, he got off at Lexington, and I had a little layover, so I took a little walk. William got me a paper and went to the washroom. And in the men's room, I looked over, and washing his hands in the lavatory beside me was Adolph Rupp again. I said, Mr. Rupp, let me ask you a question. I said, I understand that there's a rule or a law in the state of Kentucky that you have to retire at 70. A tear invaded his eye, and he said, yes, sir. I said, Mr. Rupp, what will happen to you when you retire? He looked at me, and a tear rolled down his cheeks, and the old coach said, sir, I think I'll die. I think I'll die. He had to retire. Just a few months after that conversation, I picked up my Chicago Tribune one day, and the headline said, Adolph Rupp is dead. You know why he died? He couldn't have the king in him. He didn't want to live. Now you listen to me. It's time that you realize that life is more than a Christmas tree. It's time you realize that life is more than a shopping trip. It's time you realize that life is more than a bowling league or a golf game every Saturday morning. It's time that you realize there's some responsibilities and obligations and responsibilities and some commitments in life. And it's time this old lazy, playing, picnicking, partying, fun-loving generation realize that life is made of commitments and responsibilities and duties, and to do the right means to be king on the inside of you. We've seen it in Ronald Reagan. We've seen it in Howard Jewell, the old singer that stood up here, sang for us with a king's heart. We've seen it in Russell Anderson in this last year. He faced serious cancer surgery, but never while he was having surgery. I stayed in his room all the time he was having surgery and prayed for him, because I was preaching not far from there. But never got his throne off his brow. We've seen it in Judge Bork, who ought to be on the Supreme Court. If there weren't a bunch of pinkos in the Senate, he would have been on the Supreme Court. We've seen it. Is there no king in thee? You say, okay, I'm going to take the authority of this man. That's not what king makes kings. You don't become a king because you're bossy. You don't go home and say, okay, I'm taking over. That's not royalty. You become a king when you do what you're supposed to do in life. When I was pastor of a country church in East Texas, Ms. Hyles will vouch for this, if she wants to continue eating. When I was pastor of a country church in East Texas with a handful of people, I'll guarantee you our services were conducted just like the services are here right now. And I'll guarantee you our teachers and officers meetings were the same way the ones we have now. I mean, when I just had a little handful of people, I mean, brother, it was important. And everywhere across America, a bunch of preachers are shirking their responsibility and letting the little churches go to the devil while they're waiting on that big church so someday they can be a king. You don't become a king because you're pastor of a church. God gives you a big pulpit because you already are a king. I was up in Anchorage, Alaska, and I'll close with this. I was up in Anchorage, Alaska the other night, preaching. I said this morning, it has not always been easy for me to walk on platforms in the last 8 months when I walk across America and go across America to preach. Friend and foe alike are sitting out there, some to praise me and some to curse me. I finished preaching on Tuesday night, Anchorage, Alaska. Had a wonderful service. Every once in a while, a little kingliness would escape from my preaching. I sat down after I'd preached in a wonderful service. Pastor Jerry Prevost came and put his arm on my shoulder. And as they were having the offering, they had the offering at the end, he put his arm on my shoulder and he said, Dr. Hyles, you still got it. You still got it. And I said to him, when I lose it, I want to die. And he said to me, knowing you, if you ever lose it, you will die. Is there no king in thee? Our Heavenly Father, the last sermon of this year is closed. The last message that had come from these lips in 1989 has fallen from the lips of this preacher. Oh, my God in heaven, help us to realize that life is based on responsibilities, obligations. Help us to realize there's more in life than play and fun and laughter and ha-ha and watching ball games. Oh, my soul, we need a generation of men with kings in them. A generation of women with queenly royalty in their breasts. A generation of young people who are royalty. Our heads are bowed. I ask you a question tonight. Is there no king in thee?